Well, many thanks for the invitation to come to University of Helsinki and talk. And I am really happy that one of my books has been translated into Finnish. And please keep up the good work and translate more if you like. I'm honored, deeply honored actually. Now, what I will talk about now is a little bit what scientism is. And I will go through a number of different, I got this one here, different angles to it, so to say. So what I will try to give you is some examples of scientism, and I will also talk about certain definitions of scientism, and I will try to identify certain core theses of scientism. But I also will try to identify different strategies within scientism, which makes it possible to develop scientism in quite different ways, which means that the advocates of scientism have quite different views on many important issues, and I think that's really important to understand that. And then I will also introduce another kind of terminology and talk about scientific expansionism as another term you can have and use for scientism, and talk about the people that oppose that view as scientific restrictionists. And I will also try to hint just a little bit today on why I think the view is controversial and why some people reject it, although I will talk a little bit more about that in my next lecture, even though it's going to be Professor De Ridder that will talk much more about kind of critical things having to do with the epistemology tomorrow. Now, Aku asked me this morning in this cafe why I was interested in scientism in the first place, and I thought maybe I'll say a little bit about that here. Maybe some of you heard me saying that, but I'm a philosopher of religion, so typically I'm interested in studying religious worldviews of different sorts. I'm trying, one other side that has been engaged with recently is trying to think more about Islamic worldview, what that means, what kind of implication it has. So I'll do kind of standard philosophy of religion frequently, right? But then I'm also very much interested in thinking about secular alternatives or semi-secular alternatives to religious worldviews. I'm just very, very interested in how people want to connect things and unite them as a whole, both as a theoretical thing, but also as something to be lived and practiced. And so I'm also interested in, and maybe that will be a topic another year, to think about another kind of secular, semi-secular worldview, namely environmentalism, right? So that's another kind of way of orienting your life in a certain way. And that's how I see scientism, that it's really interesting to approach it as a philosopher of religion and contrast that to different kinds of religious views of life. And that's the kind of way I got into it some time ago now. But it's still something that is interesting, and there is development in this issue. So that's the kind of background where I come from. And then at the same time, I'm also, and that might be something that I really need to stress, I'm also a great admirer of the natural scientists. Maybe I'm not a typical or stereotypical humanist, or scholar working in the humanities in that sense, that I'm really interested in the natural science and what they can deliver, and have been for a very long time, not the least biology I'm deeply interested in. So that's another thing that kind of got me going in this direction. Okay, so what's the background of scientism? I think it's the overwhelming intellectual and practical successes of science which have led some people to think that there are no real limits to the competence of science, no limits to what can be achieved in the name of science. This is sometimes called the great success of modern science argument. There is nothing outside the domain of science, nor is there any area of human life to which science cannot successfully be applied. A scientific account of anything and everything constitutes the full story of the world and its inhabitants. Or, If there are limits to the scientific enterprise, the idea is that science at least sets the boundaries for what we human can ever know about reality. That is roughly the view of scientism. I will try to make it more complicated, but that's a kind of starting point. And it's typically the great achievements of science that make some people think, well, hey, do we really need anything more than science? I think that's the kind of background to the whole thing. Because of this development, this great success of modern science, some of the defenders of scientism don't shy away from talking about scientists as the new shamans, the new religious leaders in scientific age. And here is one example. Michael Shermer thinks that now the time has come for us to show deference to our leaders, pay respect to our elders, and follow the dictates of our shamans. This being the age of science, it's scientism shamans who command our veneration. Because of language, we also are storytelling, myth-making primates, with scientism as the foundational stratum of our story, and scientists as the primary myth-makers of our time. Other advocates would not like to use that kind of language, but simply say that the view they defend could indeed be called scientism. So Alex Rosenberg writes like this, that scientism is the conviction that the methods of science are the only reliable way to secure knowledge of anything. That science descriptions of the world is correct in its fundamental, and that when complete, what science tells us will not be surprisingly different from what it tells us today. Now, still others would not use the term scientism in describing their own view, but simply say things like this. Science is the only way to understand the real world. In his essay with the revealing title, The Limitless Power of Science, Peter Atkins, a chemist, advocates the omnicompetence of science and believes that science, with its currently successful pursuit of universal competence, should be acknowledged king. Now, to the tricky question. These are, I think, examples of scientism, but how should we define scientism? Now, the first thing I think is important here is that we try to avoid pejorative definitions of scientism. It could be more or less of that, and here is just a couple of examples. No offense to these people in that sense. But this is how Massimo Pigliucci writes. I have never understood why there is so much confusion about the definition of scientism. I just looked it up in my basic Apple dictionary, and it's crystal clear. Excessive belief in the power of scientific knowledge and techniques. The second one is from John Dupré. Scientism is the exaggeration and often distorted conception of what science can be expected to do or explain for us. Now, for me, it's clear that that's the view of the critic of scientism would take. They would say such things. But I don't think we should automatically kind of indicate that scientism is an improper use of science in our way of defining it. So I would rather say that, well, let's try to see scientism in a way we see, say, feminism or naturalism, atheism or theism or so. That is a descriptive but contested term, right? But we can give it some kind of meaning that people could agree whether or not they themselves self-describe as holder of that view, or whether there are critics of them. And then again, just like feminism, you might be able to pick paradigmatic examples of it. But the border, when will you not be a feminist anymore, right? You might have paradigmatic examples when you're not that. But when do you reach that border? That's a kind of tricky question. And I will address it a little bit in what I'm saying anyway. Now, besides that, there are actually people who say that they are scientistic in their thinking, that use that as a self-description of themselves and saying they embrace scientism, like Sherman and Rosenberg, Pinker, And I think in some recent statements I read by Dawkins, he kind of say, yeah, sure, I don't mind if you call my view scientism. And they, of course, they don't think that their view of science is distorted in any way. So if we want to take that into account, we need to try to find some kind of definition that is decently neutral. And I will try to provide you with one. The second problem is, what should we call these people that hold on to scientism? It might be nice to have a name for those. Now, the problem is, of course, we can't just call them scientists, because there are, for instance, philosophers that would embrace it, and they're not scientists. And then on the other hand, there, of course, are a lot of scientists that are strongly opposed to scientism. So scientists wouldn't be a good name for this group of people. Now, in this book that's been translated into Finnish, I call them science believers. And that's also a tricky notion. I will give you, I have used another notion there, and I will introduce a third one today. But it's also important that one understands what I mean when I'm talking about science believers, because one of the objections I've got is, well, we are not the people that believe things. We know things, right? So talk about us as believers is just totally inappropriate. And that's not what I mean when I talk about science believers, because I use believers in a religious sense, in its faith aspect. That is to say, well, you might have heard this thing that Martin Luther said, that what you ultimately put your trust or your faith in is in reality your God. And it's in that sense I'm talking. That is what you really build your life on, what is the fundament, what is really the foundation of what you do. You put your ultimate trust in. That's what I mean by science, really the issue by using the word believer. But it's of course tricky today, because believers have this tendency that you want to always contrast it with knowledge. So, well, I don't know, I've decided that I should not use it today, because there is another technical term that has come up. I don't know if it's a good one, and I certainly don't know how to translate it into Finnish or even Swedish. And that is another term that's been used, and that's scienticizer. Don't know if it's good or not, but there's this kind of term that's so you're talking about scienticizers, right? And scienticizing and things like that. I don't know if these are very good terms, but that's another one one can use. And I don't think this, well, there was one more thing I wanted to say about the science believer thing here. And I think it's important that some of the advocates of the scientistic way of thinking aren't that far from saying these things themselves. Edward O. Wilson, that I will come back to a number of times here, he described himself in the preface to Consilience as a former fervent or passionate Baptist turned fervent believer in science. So it's not problematic for some of the people that embrace scientism to see it in that kind of faith framework, so to say. But it's a tricky thing what to call these things, and we have to find some kind of way of dealing with that. Now, I will suggest a definition of scientism that I think is fairly open, but it's also a number of sentences, right? Or it was a long sentence, I guess. It's just one, but it's a long one. So it's a kind of tricky, and there are short versions one can use instead. But I'll try to explain my way of thinking about that. And this is the kind of core definition of scientism that I'm going to give. And that also kind of introduced another technical term you could use. You can, instead of talking about science believer or scienticizers, you can talk about scientific expansionists. So if you're a scientific expansionist, you embrace scientism. So this is the way of thinking, one way of thinking of science that goes back to this great success argument of the modern science, saying that science is the view that the boundaries of the natural sciences, yeah, right, I'll have to say something about that in a minute. The boundaries of science could and should be expanded in such a way that things have not previously been understood as proper part of science can now, or will eventually become science. Or, if that is not possible, it must be rejected and not taken to be part of the real world, or at least something we cannot have genuine knowledge about. So the core idea of scientism is saying, well, hey, science has been extremely successful. Now, maybe there isn't any real limits to science. We can just expand the boundaries. And you remember that Atkins quotation I gave you. I talked about the omnicompetence of science. So if you're an extreme scientific-minded thinker, you think there are just not really any boundaries for natural science. We don't really need anything else to understand ourselves and understand the world or anything. We just expand that. It looks like morality, for instance, is outside the reach of scientists. It looks like intentions, values, and other things are kind of outside. But that's just not going to be the case. We don't need anything else. It looks like the humanities are a separate, autonomous academic field, but that's not the case. We can just expand the natural science into the humanities and scienticize what's going on there. So we don't really need the old humanities anymore. Now that would be another kind of what I in the book call academic internal scientism. So you can restrict scientism in many, many different ways. There's a couple of things that needs to be said here. So I think it's important to see that there are stronger and there are weaker versions of scientism, and people can be more or less ambitious in their ideas about how to expand these boundaries. And for that reason, I think scientific expansionist is another term you could use. And this is also why I don't think we should take scientism lightly, in the sense that nobody really knows where the limits of the natural sciences runs. I mean, it might be possible to expand some of these boundaries quite further than we have thought. So it's not, I think it's really important to be open-minded to the idea that, yeah, maybe the natural sciences could do a lot more than we have thought. There might be some serious problems here, there might be some category mistakes, there might be other things coming in that makes you want to be hesitant. And I guess that's my actual position myself, that I'm a scientific restrictionist in a certain way. But I don't want to be dogmatic about that. I want to be open-minded and see, well, maybe there's ways to expand that in the future. Right, so but then there's the second part of the definition then, of course, has to do with, well, right, what should we do with the parts that are not within the boundaries of science? How should we respond to that? And there's different possibilities in this. I mean, as we will see, one thing is just to say, well, if it's outside the boundaries of the natural sciences, well, it won't exist, or we can't have any knowledge of it, or so. But if you can also be much, much more restricted, and that's what I will talk about tomorrow, and say, well, Michael, you know, I don't have any particular views about the limits of knowledge or anything about that. But I have a particular view about the academics. And there is no academic discipline that is worth anything if it's not using the natural science methods. So that's why I'm extremely critical against the humanities, because these methods haven't really creeped in and reformed that area. As one of the people I read said, well, there is a kind of, we want to get adult knowledge into the humanities. So now it's a kind of childish knowledge that we have there. So we really need to improve the humanities. And we do that by bringing it in under the umbrella of the natural sciences, right? But this person might not have any views about other things outside the academia, right? So it's just an internal perspective. And that's a kind of limit form of scientism. And I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow in my next lecture. Now, so the alternative terminology, if you want to use to, right, there was one more thing I need to say, and that has to do with science here, right? It's extremely important that we don't think, when we talk about science here, we're talking about Wissenschaft, or in Swedish, vetenskap, or whatever you call it in Finnish. I think it might be similar to Wissenschaft in that sense, that all the academic disciplines are included automatically in the term. Now, this is not the way the word is normally used in English, and it's definitely not the way the word is used by the people that embrace scientism. It's the natural sciences. And for some of them, it's even more narrow than that. One former Nobel Prize winner in physics said a thing like this, Ernst Rutherford. He said, all science is either physics or stamp collecting. So he didn't really think there was all that much to biology either, right? So he had a kind of quite shrinking view of what real science is. It's physics, basically, right? So there's room within the scientism group to have broader or narrower. And some of the more liberal one, whatever to call it, might say, well, yeah, I think when I was in debate with Rosenberg that I quote down there, he said, yeah, maybe there is some parts of economics that might be part of science, but no more than that. So he kind of said, well, yeah, a little bit of that anyway. So he got a little bit into the social sciences, he would say. But the way I normally interpret it in when I'm talking now is that we're talking about the natural sciences when we talk about science. And I think that's extremely important to have in mind, because that's why it also kind of matters how to treat the humanities. Now, if you want to have a very short version of it, but it wouldn't cover it all, you have Rosenberg's own formulation at the bottom there. And he's saying, being scientistic just means treating science as our exclusive guide to reality, to nature, both our own nature and everything else. So it's the exclusive guide we've got to use. The only, and there's ways of phrasing that. It's a weaker one. I will come back to say, well, it's not the only really reliable way. And that's the way I interpret the idea about adult knowledge and child knowledge, right? So it's not that it couldn't find anything like a little bit of knowledge somewhere else, but it's not really real knowledge. That's just one place where you can find that. Okay, the people that would respond to this view, you could call them scientific restrictionists. And typically they would say that there is more to reality than what natural sciences can discover. There is limit to the competence of natural science, and it's not an omnicompetence. Natural sciences are extremely good, but there are limits to it. So, and here's just one example how such an argument might go. Restrictionists could argue that humanities are okay as they are because questions within these disciplines presuppose methods and theories which can handle values, reasons, meanings, intentions. And the methods and theories of the natural sciences cannot capture these features of reality and are thus inappropriate or at least of limited use in this regard. Or they could maintain that the scope of what we can know is not limited to or can be reduced to scientific knowledge. The humanities gives us, on this view, among other things, hermeneutical knowledge, knowledge how to interpret texts not accessible to the methods of the natural sciences. The world is taken by them to be bigger than the world of the natural sciences, and they also believe that we can obtain knowledge about this bigger world which cannot be reduced to scientific knowledge. Now the question is, can we kind of develop and identify some core theses of scientism? And I and other people have tried to do that, and I'll just give you some kind of examples of how that will go. So quite often it's explicated in terms, especially in terms of two theses, the T1 and T2 here. So if you're saying that science is our exclusive guide to reality, like Rosenberg said, or Dawkins said, science is the only way to understand the real world, that kind could be interpreted as accepting T1 or T1 and T2. So T1 simply says that, well, if we want to say that there is knowledge, the only kind of knowledge we can get is the one that is provided by the sciences. Now, the second one is stronger than the first one in the sense that there might be things that exist that science cannot discover. That's what T1 allows for. But T2 wouldn't allow for that. T2 would say, well, if science can't discover it, it won't exist. And we, of course, have to, I mean, we shouldn't just think about science today. I mean, it's also how it will develop. And then people can have different views, as you saw in the Rosenberg quotation. He said that, well, it will be basically like it is today, right? So he kind of add that thing to it. That could be up for discussion what science will look like in another 1,000 years. But there is a difference between these two claims. Sometimes I think also it's a kind of other claims involved here. And that's saying, well, we are rationally entitled to believe only what can be scientifically justified. So whereas T1 says something about the limits of knowledge, T3 says something about the limits of rationality. And I think if we just take an internal affairs in the natural sciences, you could see the difference between these two if you don't grasp them immediately. Just think about the theories that have been developed about multiverses, that there are parallel universes, and some of them aren't even really connected causally to us in any way or so. Now, one can say that within cosmology, one can, yeah, it's rational to these theories are rationally justified, but we wouldn't want to say that we know that there are multi-universes, right? But there are other things we want to say. We want to say that we know that evolutionary theory is true or whatever. So you can kind of see the distinction between these two. Now, and this, of course, will have a lot of bearing on other things that we might be interested in. And I'll just talk about two things. I will give you an example when we're thinking about God, and I will give you an example about one of my thoughts, namely that I'm now thinking of scientism, and I will try to exemplify those two with these lines here. Now, the thing is, if we want to know whether God exists or not, if we want to know that, then we have to go through the means of the natural sciences. If we through those means can establish that God exists, then we could know that God exists. And that's the only way we could know that God exists. But that is still open for the possibility that God exists, right? It's just that we can't know that. There might be many things we don't know that exist. And God might be one of those. But T2 closes that door as well. So T2 says, well, if that's the outcome, then there is no God, because science can't discover it, and science has the limits, not just for knowledge, but for what exists. So that's a lot stronger claim. Now, these things could be combined with a rejection of T3, saying, well, I do understand that there is a lot of religious people that might have had religious experiences. Right. But these religious experiences can't provide the basis for knowledge that God exists. But you might want to say, yeah, but I understand that if you have had those experiences, it's rational for you to believe that God exists. But you can't know that. And then you would not hold on to T3. But then you can say, well, hey, it's not even rational to believe anything whatsoever unless science can give you some evidence for it. So, to exemplify that more strongly then, I'm now thinking about science. I'm now thinking about scientism. If you take that belief, I think I know that I'm thinking about scientism now, right? But that's not possible according to T1, unless the natural sciences can really show that I know that. I think I know it through introspection, but that's not an allowed source of knowledge. You've got to go through the natural sciences. And then it's this peculiar thing that it is, I call it a belief. And that belief, and the question then is it possible for the natural science to identify beliefs in the world? If they can't identify beliefs, then there are no beliefs in the real world, right? That would be T2. Now, most people that would embrace scientism would not say that, well, yeah, sure, Michael, it's rational for you to believe that you're now thinking about scientism, but it's not knowledge. So they would grant me that introspection at least give me a justified belief. So then you see how these things go, and you also see the bite. If you didn't feel the bite when it came to God, at least I think you can feel the bite, and you can feel that why it might be controversial to hold these views. Because many of the beliefs we are formed aren't really the results of the natural sciences. And they need to go through a process of scientization to be allowed to be genuine instances of knowledge. And that's why well, that's part of the controversiality of this view. So let me then try to contrast, and then now we're coming also to a question about how strong we should make T1 here, and whether you have to say embrace T1 in order to be an advocate of scientism. And I think we can most easily see that if we contrast these views with other epistemologies or theories of knowledge. So T1 is just the one that I call here epistemic exclusivism. The only kind of genuine knowledge we can have is the one provided by the sciences. That's a kind of epistemic exclusivism, right? Now, there is a weaker claim that's just saying that science gives us the best or the most reliable form of knowledge we can have. And I call that, this is not part of the book, but I have some thoughts after the book, so. And I'll just call it epistemic privilegism here. Now, the tricky thing is, if you embrace 2 here, would you then be classified as a defender of scientism? And that's a really difficult question. Because I think many of us might, maybe it's the most reliable form. But in the debate between the natural sciences and the humanities, there's a lot of people within the humanities that don't really think that the sciences give a more reliable form of knowledge than the humanities can give. So they, in that debate, would say if you hold 2 here, you're scientistic in your thinking. But then again, it's up for grab how strong you will make these claims. Both the Rosenberg and the Dawkins quotations I gave are more recently interpreted as versions of number 1 here. But epistemic privilegism is another possibility, and whether you kind of reach the border for scientism or not is an open question here, right? Now, I think the position that many of the people in the humanities would take would be like be like 3 here. They would say science gives important knowledge about the natural world, sure, but scientific knowledge should not be privileged over other forms of knowledge. And this is extremely important within the humanities, right? Because if we privilege the natural sciences all the time, the knowledge that humanities will produce would be second-rated. And they wouldn't want, many of the people in the humanities wouldn't want to have that view. So that would be kind of the position they hold. Now, in the humanities, there's another form of more subversive epistemology that's floating around. And I've heard some natural scientists embrace it as well, but it's more frequently within the humanities. And that is the idea, don't even think that science is an exception in any way, because all forms of knowledge, they are essentially social constructions. And even though scientists think they are above social, political, economical interests and power structures, that is just an illusion. So there's also another kinds of understanding of knowledge that cause a lot of debate, heated debate in this kind of discussion. And I think both 3 and 4 could be found in the humanities, although I think 3 is more frequently held anyway. But I just want to tell you that that's the kind of what I call a radical epistemic social constructionism or postmodernism. And that's another kind of way of thinking of knowledge. Now, to the question, what kind of people are opposed to scientism? And then I think it's extremely important to think that there are different groups for different reasons that are opposed to scientism. So the group that's most frequently have been associated being against scientism, at least when I've been talking about it, but maybe that's because I'm a philosopher of religion working at a theological department, is that, well, gosh, Michael, it's theologians and some philosophers a little bit that are inclined to religion and inclined to believe in religion. Yeah, you're right, there is some scientists as well, but they are theists, all of them, right? And that group certainly exists, and is an important group. Now, there's just one comment I want to make concerning that group, and that is that religious believers are not a homogeneous group, neither are theologians. So there is a number of quite influential theologians and religious thinkers and others that would actually embrace a certain kind of scientism. There is a technical term, and if you're interested in looking into that, it's often called religious naturalism. So there's also groups within the religious community and so forth that would accept something like scientism, and it's not a problem for them at all. So that's the only qualifier I want to make there. Now, it's important to see that there are also a large group of atheists, agnostics, skeptics, and naturalists, and here I just list a group of people that are opposed to it. And they are opposed to it for different kinds of reasons. And the only example I will give you is Massimo Pigliucci's reasons here, just so you get an idea. He thinks that scientism are doing atheism a disservice. And why would that be the case? Because scientism only allows you to use scientific arguments against belief in God or religion or so forth. And he thinks those arguments aren't particularly good. He thinks the best arguments one can use to argue against theism or belief in God or things like that are philosophical arguments. But philosophical arguments don't seem to be scientific arguments, right? So this whole group is disqualified. I would assume he thinks that one of the most important arguments against belief in God is the so-called problem of evil, that there is so much evil in the world, and that's the one core reason why we shouldn't believe in the Christian or Muslim or Jewish God and so forth. But that's a kind of basically philosophical argument. It draws on values too, and it's kind of, well, how do you phrase that if you only can use scientific knowledge? Yeah, it's not quite easy to do that. So for him, he thinks the atheists like Rosenberg that accept scientism are actually doing atheists a disservice. So it's important to see that this is a quite forceful group as well. And then the third group is the one that I've talked a little bit about earlier. And these are, of course, scholars within the humanities that don't think humanities are without problems, but they don't think that a solution to that is a scientization of the humanities. They think they can learn things from science, but they're not ready to go in under the dictates of the natural sciences when they're doing the humanities. So they are strongly opposed scientific ideas about the expansion of the natural sciences far into the humanities. And again, here's again a border question. How far in do you have to go to be scientific here? Well, I think if you want to change the core methods of the humanities, you're scientific. If you say you just wanted to add, which has already happened, statistics to the humanities, no problem at all. and many other things, right? So it's a tricky question, how much could you add? And so that's a kind of internal discussion going on. But these are three kinds of groups that respond to scientism. Now, next I just want to go over these different strategies that scientific-minded people or scienticizers might have, and why they end up with quite radically different conclusions. And I'll just give you, I might give you two examples. I'll start with morality. This is Edward Wilson. He wants a scientization of morality. He thinks morality is extremely important. Extremely important. But he's been looking at the scholars in humanities, he's been looking at the philosophers, and there is just no progress. Nothing is really happening there. So he kind of thinks, well, why don't we give the philosopher a sabbatical, send them away for a while, and then we'll let the biologically scholars get in there and see what they can do instead. So we try to get some progress going on here. So you see what I'm saying here? Scientists and humanities should consider together the possibility that the time has come for ethics to be removed temporarily, that's the sabbatical, from the hands of the philosophers and biologized. It is astonishing that the study of ethics advanced so little since the 19th century. The most distinguished and vital quality of the human species remains a blank space of the scientific map. And this is kind of the most interesting thing, I think. One day we shall, by means of neurobiology, acquire a genetically accurate and hence completely fair code of ethics. So he thinks that by drawing in moral, there is no moral knowledge really, but by getting biologists to work on it, they might eventually be able to give us moral knowledge. So that's his take on it, right? So he wants a scientization of morality, bring it in under the umbrella of the natural sciences. So that's one way as a scientific thinker to handle morality. Now here's the other one. And that is, instead of going for the scientization process, or making it into science, that is to say, well, sorry guys, we can't make science out of this, so let's reject it. Just eliminate it. And that's Rosenberg's take on it. So he says, scientism starts with the idea that physical facts fix all the facts. The biological facts can't guarantee that our core morality is the right, true, or correct one. If the biological facts can't do it, then nothing can. That's, I added, scientific nihilism. And we have to accept it, despite that it might create a public relation nightmare for scientism. So he's just saying, well, values aren't really anything that the natural sciences can do any reasonable thing about, and these kinds of things. And therefore we just have to drop them. Because that's the option you have. You either go for a scientization process or an elimination process. Now take the second example that has to do with religion and God. Then you can see that a person like Richard Dawkins would be an example of the elimination strategy. So he would say, well, if we want to know whether God exists, right, we just check it out using scientific methods. If we can't use those and we can't obtain a conclusion on that, or if we can obtain a conclusion, we draw a certain conclusion to that. And then we just try to get rid of religion and God and all that. So we eliminate it from the field of knowledge and the field of reality. Again, going to Wilson, he is going for, just like when he did with the morality thing, he's pretty much doing the same thing with religion. Because he thinks that the religious drive, the religious impulse, is hardwired into us. So even though he thinks a lot of religions have a lot of false beliefs and things like that, he really thinks there is something deep in human nature that need nurturing for us to function well as human beings. So for him, we need some kind of substitute. The old traditional religions won't do. But we need a substitute. We need something else to bring along. And then he's thinking, well, I know, he says, that this isn't so comfortable for many scientists, but maybe we scientists really have to step in here. And we can't really, do all the things that religious leaders did, but maybe we can do some of that. And maybe we can think that even if we think that the grand religious narratives in the Bible and so forth are false, can we provide people with a new narrative that can give their life meaning, hook up with the religious impulse, and make people flourish? Yeah, he says maybe the evolutionary epic could be used in that way. So his way of taking it is just different, very, very different from Dawkins. Although they are both, I would say, scientifically minded thinkers, they just go in they use these different strategies. And because you can use these different strategies with a lot of things, you can go up in very different directions in how you develop scientism. Basic strategies that scientifically minded people or scienticizers tend to use. So either you can say, well, this is something that has not been really a part of science, like morality, for instance. Right. So what we do then is that we have to go through a transformation, maybe partially reductionistic, at least a scientization process, to make it appropriate, to make it something that is taken into account. Or we could go for the different strategy, and that is the rejection or elimination strategy. Now, some people who go for that when it comes to religion, and especially morality, don't always want to say it as bluntly as Rosenberg did. They want to say, yeah, well, it's true that morality don't really have a base. It's not really something we can discover and deal appropriately with in the natural sciences. But it's a useful fiction. It's a useful illusion. So maybe we shouldn't, after all, talk too loud about that, because it's important that people think that there is something in morality for getting the society to work. And they might think the same thing about free will. That's another topic that's been involved. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them think that free will is an illusion because the natural sciences can't discover the free will. And if the natural sciences can't discover it, it probably won't exist. Then they kind of run into studies saying that scientific studies, that's saying that if you tell people that they don't have a free will, you can see the implications on that is that these people in these research environments, they treat other people worse than whether they think they have a free will. And then you can kind of say, well, yeah, sure. So maybe it's a useful illusion so we shouldn't take that away. So there's also kind of thinking about what should be said or not, and then I think that's one reason why some of the people that embrace scientism aren't all that happy about Rosenberg's idea, because he might create a public nightmare, at least for some versions of scientism, but just for some versions of it. Now, there is a third strategy that isn't so common these days. It was much more common when logical positivism was in its heydays in the 40s and 50s. And that is to declare things that seems like true statements, for instance, but not really fall within the domain of the natural sciences, or be analytically true or conceptually true, is to say, well, these are meaningless. And that's another strategy. But it can also be taken in a different way, and I just want to give you one example of that. And this is from Rose, Ladyman, and Spirit. They have what I will call a forget about it strategy. So they say that they admire science to the point of frank scientism, and should it turn out that science itself realizes that it cannot answer certain questions, so if science themselves realize that, right, then we should not look to another institution other than science to answer such questions. We should, in these cases, forget about the questions. So that's another kind of strategy, of course. It's not quite as popular, I think, because it seems a little problematic, perhaps. But that's another possibility, of course, to say that these are not real questions, so we should ignore that. They're not really worth thinking into. You should just think about those questions that science can answer, and forget about the rest. So that's another conclusion. Now, another option, sorry. Now to the conclusion. Sorry. So I do think science is an interesting, extremely, in some cases, extremely ambitious worldview. Like I said, there are weaker and stronger forms of it, and for that reason it might be more or less controversial. But it's certainly worth taking seriously because, as I see it, it's not clear how far the boundaries of science can be extended. We might be a little dogmatic on that. It might be possible to extend it further than we have thought. Moreover, some of the proponents of scientism, again, are more ambitious in their extensions of the boundaries of science than others. And for this reason, I propose that we treat people's acceptance of scientism as a matter of degree, so we can talk about weaker and stronger forms of scientism. So I want to give you a decent understanding of what scientism is. I think I already hinted, but I at least have problems with some of the versions. But it's also very important to see that it's not a unified view. People can go in quite different directions within the umbrella of scientism, which isn't strange. That happens with feminism. There are different forms of feminism, for instance, different forms of theism, different forms of atheism, and so forth. So I guess it's not revolutionary, but it's important to keep that in mind. And I'll quit by saying this, and the next time I'll talk, I guess, is tomorrow, and then I will try to say a little bit more about scientism in relation to humanities, but also one thing that I've been very interested in, namely our everyday life world. A book I wrote on my dissertation was on rationality, and it had to do with and then I said, we have to understand everyday life if we want to develop appropriate theories of rationality. And I think, so I'm a great defender of everyday life. So I will try to bring that into discussion tomorrow. So it's not just going to be about natural science and about humanities. It will also be about our everyday life world and how these three things contribute to our worldview and different ways of seeing that. Thank you.